do not want to miss this next session. Hello again. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Daron Acemoglu. And Daron is an institute professor at MIT. So bear with me, I'm going to have to read this because he has amazing background here. An elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the British Academy of Sciences, the Turkish Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, the European Economic Association, and the Society of Labor Economists. Daron is the author of 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. His academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, technological change, inequality, labor economics, and economics of networks. Daron will give a presentation on innovations in equity and healing, and then I'll have the pleasure of moderating a conversation with him. So now I'll turn it over to Daron.
Thank you, Alfreda. It's my pleasure to be joining, albeit remotely. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk about inequality and how to tackle some of the most pernicious effects of inequality that have developed in the US and around the world. So as a starting point, I want to show that something is wrong in the labor market in the US. On the left, I am depicting the growth of private sector spending on labor in the 4 decades that followed World War II. It is a remarkable picture because what it shows is that pretty much in every year in those 4 decades, private sector spending on labor increased by more than 2 percentage points faster than population in real terms. So all else being equal, you would expect that this would translate to something like 2% a year growth rate in real incomes of workers, and in fact, it did exactly that. But on the right, you see a sea change. The private sector wage bill growth first slows down and then flattens out for over the last 35 years or so. Some of the consequences of this very sluggish growth of firms' willingness to hire and pay labor are quite apparent. For example, the decline in the labor share. But even more importantly, it is connected to the huge changes in the US wage structure. This picture here, or these two figures here, summarize those changes. What I'm doing is depicting the real wage growth of 10 demographic groups, going all the way from red, high school dropouts, all the way to the dark blue, workers with postgraduate degrees. And what you see is that in the 1960s and early 70s, and the same is true in the 1950s using different data sources, you have a period of rising tide lifting all boats. All 10 demographic groups, men and women and by education, are growing at more or less the same rate, and their earnings are increasing about 2% a year. But then you see a fundamental transformation of the US labor market. The gap between the top and the bottom, both for men and the women, is opening up very sharply. And even men with just a college degree, no postgraduate degree, are experiencing very little wage gains during the last 35 years or so. And in fact, the situation is much worse for men with less than college. Those with 2-year degrees, high school degrees, or no high school diploma are experiencing fairly sharp declines in their real earnings. The same is true for women, except for the general catch-up of women to men, reducing the gender wage gap. I don't need to tell you that these inequality trends have had very negative social consequences, including in our politics. Inequality is not a US phenomenon, even if US is the leader in inequality and in the increase in inequality. So here I'm showing an omnibus measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. And US starts out as the most unequal in the OECD, although nothing compared to Latin American or South Asian countries. So a Gini of around 3.3. But it has had a tremendous increase in the inequality. But many other countries have had similar increases, starting with much lower levels: Sweden, Finland, New Zealand, the UK, and Germany. Many of these countries, with the exception of Germany, the UK, and the UK, haven't had the sharp declines at the bottom of the wage distribution because of minimum wages and other protection for low-paid workers, but the overall trends are quite similar. What is even more telling is that when you look at the changes in the occupational structure, those are quite parallel across OECD countries as well. So here I am dividing all jobs in the OECD countries into bottom, middle, and top tercile in terms of their occupational skill or occupational wage. So the red group here is the middle paying one. It's the backbone of the middle class. It includes blue-collar, operator, construction, transport jobs, as well as office jobs, clerical jobs, sales, retail, and so on. All of these middle-class occupations have been on the decline in almost all countries. In some places, they've been replaced by lower-paying jobs. In many places, because of educational upgrading, somewhat higher-paying jobs. But the middle-class jobs are very scarce. Such transformative changes have many causes, ranging from globalization to institutional changes. But my research emphasizes that we cannot understand these patterns without studying how the technological composition or the composition of new technologies or technological advances have evolved over time. Economists sometimes have a very optimistic view of technology. Technology increases productivity, and that benefits everybody, including workers. And Keynes, in his 1929 essay on the world for our grandchildren, had warned of technological unemployment because of automation and mechanization, and most economists did not believe that Keynes had that right, because it is almost a second nature to most economists to think that technological change will ultimately benefit workers. The reason why this approach actually is now, in my opinion at least, dated, is because it does not distinguish different types of technologies. Not all technologies are created equal, and some are beneficial for workers and some are actually harmful for workers. The types of technologies that I showed here are the ones that automate work, especially middle class work. And those tend to reduce the labor share, tend to reduce labor demand, and tend to generate the types of patterns that I showed in the previous slides. The reason why Keynes's most dire predictions did not come to pass was because automation, which was very rapid when Keynes was writing, for example, in agriculture, and continued to be rapid in the 1950s and the 1960s, was counterbalanced by other kinds of technologies. So more broadly, there are technologies that displace workers from the works that they do, such as robots, current applications of AI, some office software. And there are technologies that reinstate workers into new jobs, new tasks, new opportunities. If you look at the 40 years that followed World War II, the reason why labor demand was so growing so healthily was not because there wasn't automation and displacement. There was a lot of it, but it was almost perfectly counterbalanced by reinstatement, by new tasks, new opportunities for workers of all skill levels. And that's why it was also a broadly shared type of growth. But fast forward to the last 30 years, and you see a very different picture. Displacement accelerates, and reinstatement and other kind of changes decelerate, so that their net effect on labor demand is a big negative. And this displacement is very closely connected to automation. Now that's a little bit abstract, but let's zero in onto one specific example of an automation technology, industrial robotics. In fact, industrial robots have been a lifesaver for many US industries, enabling them to compete in the world stage. And they are among the most productive technologies that US manufacturing adopted. So if you are of the view that technologies that increase productivity will somehow trickle down to workers, you should expect that industries and local economies that are adopting more robots should ultimately create more jobs and pay higher wages. In fact, exactly the opposite happens in the US. So from the period of 1993 to 2007, stopping it in 2007 so that it's not doesn't intersect with the Great Recession's impact on manufacturing, you see that local labor markets that have adopted more robots and that have adopted more robots because of their industrial and occupational structure, and that's what this exposure to robots measure captures, have had much worse employment performance. This is showcased, but is not driven by the industrial heartland of the United States, places like Beaumont, Texas, Cleveland, and of course, Detroit. Firms benefited, firm owners benefited, but workers were displaced from their work. In fact, you can also show that in those local labor markets, wages fell, inequality increased. Robots are, of course, a very specific type of technology, and they are at the heart of modern industrial automation. But what about AI? Some people are much more promising, much more optimistic about what AI promises, because its biggest enthusiasts and boosters tell us that AI is going to create a lot of jobs. Yes, potentially this is possible because AI is a broad technological platform that can be used for many applications, including for those that create new tasks and increase human productivity. In practice, however, AI adoption has so far been driven by the business model of big tech companies targeted at displacing humans. You can see that in a number of different ways that my recent work with David Otter and Pascual Restrepo and Joe Hazel documents. And here is one simple way of doing it. Classify establishments across the US into those that have lots of replaceable tasks that are at the risk of being displaced. And in fact, it is almost entirely those establishments that are looking on replacing these tasks that are driving the AI adoption. And worse, when you look at their hiring, those establishments, the green ones and to some extent the blue ones, are seriously falling behind the rest, again indicating that AI is being associated with a lot of automation and that automation is not being beneficial for workers. Why are we doing so much automation? Some will tell us that this is because the future path of technology is preordained, and this is the way to make progress. And if we don't make it, China will, or this is the way that we're going to create greater prosperity. Actually, that doesn't really square up very well. First of all, uh, you know, actually, let me show this slide first. First of all, we don't seem to be getting the productivity benefits from these new digital technologies, and especially from AI. So looking at the measure of total factor productivity, the most common measure that economists use for gauging the extent of productivity improvements at the aggregate economy, if you look at the period of pre-digital era, you have total factor productivity growth of almost 3% a year for many of those decades, and most of the time close to 2%. And today, in the age of digital technologies, many patents, many new gadgets, we are just around 0.5%. And the same is true when you look at industry studies and so on. So we are going through a period of very disappointing productivity growth. And in fact, the reason why automation is being adopted so rapidly doesn't really have that much to do with the super productivity of these automation technologies. It has been a reaction to a number of major trends. One of them is global competition. Automation became a much bigger deal in the US in response to competition from Japan and then from China. But even more importantly, the business models of the most important companies today, the big tech companies such as Netflix, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, have a business model and approach that is all centered on automation. It is no surprise that these companies are employing less than a tenth of comparable companies in the past when you look at their overall sales, because they are not in the business of employing humans, they're in the business of using algorithms to replace humans. And their effects are not just confined to their sector, but are spread out throughout the economy because they are at the leading edge, cutting edge of technology, and other companies emulate their technology, emulate their business model. But it's not just a story of the private sector. The government has also contributed to excessive automation. If you look at the US tax code, it taxes labor much more heavily, around 25%. It always used to tax capital more lightly so that companies received an implicit subsidy. But since 2000, that subsidy has multiplied so that today companies pay less than 5% when they use software and equipment for automation. So they are saving about 20% of their costs by automating instead of hiring labor. That's a massive subsidy for automation to US companies. It is also important that these are not just industrialized nation problems. We are, of course, focused on the US. Inequality is a huge problem in the US, but it's also a huge problem in the developing world, both within emerging countries and between emerging and developed nations. And looked at it from the viewpoint that I have presented here, automation technologies and AI, as it becomes more and more of an automation technology, despite its potential promise of doing other things, are going to be examples of what economists in the 1960s and 70s used to call inappropriate technologies. Technologies developed in the developed world, industrialized nations, but then that are inappropriate for the conditions of the developing nations. And that is because the emerging world is scarce in the skills that are necessary for AI, and it's scarce in capital, and it's abundant in human resources. Most of these countries can go very fast by making better use of their human resources, but increasingly, AI is going to rob them of that potential as well if it continues on this path. The post-COVID world, left to its own devices, will go more towards automation. Most companies have accelerated their automation because of social distancing and labor shortages. But I want to hasten to add that the future does not need to be automated, fully automated. Of course, we need automation, just like we did during the mechanization of agriculture and in the first few decades that followed World War II. But we need that automation to be counterbalanced by other technologies that make humans more productive. Or we need automation to be at the service of humans, not at the service of large companies and the big bosses, and going in the direction of replacing workers. That means that we have to start with a key realization that the direction of technology is a choice. Even if we are told by Silicon Valley tycoons that they are doing what the future of technology wants, that's not actually true. There are many different ways of using technologies. It's not something preordained that you have to use digital technologies to monitor workers and to make their jobs less meaningful or to eliminate their jobs. You can use these technologies to create jobs as well. So that means we have to really think about regulation of technology. However, therein lies the problem. Regulation of technology and regulation of economic activities so that we generate more productive, more equitable distributions is something that democracies do. But democracy actually is under attack as well. Democracy is being harmed both by the direct effects of the increase in inequality and the direct effects of technologies in the area of social media, communication, and also monitoring by companies and by governments. This is actually a remarkable trend. The political scientist Samuel Huntington dubbed the movement in the 1980s, 90s, the third wave of democracy, because so many countries were becoming democratic during those times, especially after the fall of the Southern European dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. But over the last 15 years, we've entered the reversal of that wave. According to Freedom House, every year since 2006, more countries have moved away from democracy or have weakened their democratic institutions. Worse, if you look at people's attitudes, they have much less trust in democratic governments than they do under authoritarian governments, partly again because of the technologies that I have mentioned. Authoritarian governments have been very good at using these technologies for brainwashing and for control of their populations. So these are actually also related to many of the other challenges that we face because they are global and many of the technologies are going to be involved with the issues such as climate change and the way that globalization is going to go on. So I think what this all brings me to is that we may be at a time or at a critical juncture for the future of democracy and future of shared prosperity. In fact, shared prosperity and future of democracy are tightly linked because they have to travel together. It's very difficult to have shared prosperity when democratic institutions are weakened or collapse. And it's also very difficult to maintain democratic institutions where automation is so fast and control of workers and citizens by large companies and governments via technologies becomes so extensive. So what that means is that we have to find a way of building new inclusive institutions. This is what I think is going to be the key challenge of remaking the post-COVID world. The way that I tend to think about this is that we need to recreate some of the good aspects of the first welfare state experiment that started in Scandinavia in the 1930s and then very rapidly in continental Europe and the UK after World War II. But we have to make it stronger and more efficient and add to it this regulation of technology because automation, if it becomes uncontrolled, is going to undermine every aspect that we might ask from state institutions, democracy, and shared prosperity. But therein lies another challenge. One of the greatest social scientists of the 20th century, Friedrich von Hayek, wrote his celebrated book, The Road to Serfdom, in response to the Beveridge Report, which came out in 1942 in the darkest hour of the war, and provided a blueprint for the welfare state institutions that would develop in the UK and Europe in the decades that followed. It was an amazing document. It energized Britain. Some people credit it with Britain turning around the war because the whole population became so much uplifted by the promise of more equitable distribution. However, Hayek thought different. He was worried that the state playing so much of a role in redistribution, minimum wages, social security, national health care, aid to families with children, all the things that we take for granted for now, they would mean that liberty would be at risk, state bureaucrats would become very strong, the market system would collapse. At the end, Hayek was wrong. None of that happened. In fact, democracy deepened in every place that introduced these welfare state institutions. And one way of thinking about that, and this is my last slide, is provided in my recent book with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. We reinterpret the history of thousands of years of economic and social and political development in a very simple way. We think it all turns down the balance between the power of the state, ability to provide services, capacity, as well as repression, and the power of society, regular people, non-elites, to participate in politics, which can take formal or de jure or de facto means. Democracy, shared prosperity exists in what we call the narrow corridor, when the power of the state and power of society are balanced. And in this corridor, these arrows indicate you have dynamics that empower both the state, increasing its capacity, shouldering more responsibilities, and society's participation in politics. The way that Hayek was worried is that you can interpret it as this balance being broken. But in fact, these arrows going up, which we call the Red Queen effect after Alice in Wonderland, is that when the state becomes stronger, society gets to run faster. In order to be able to communicate its wishes to society, control bureaucrats, control politicians. That's exactly what happened in Europe and to some extent in the US in the decades that followed World War II. And the question is whether we can do so in the context of creating a more shared form of prosperity, or what I'm calling welfare state 3.0, and in the process prove Hayek wrong again. Thank you very much. I look forward to the questions and comments.
Thank you, Daron. Wow. I'm going to unpack a lot of that. There's so much that you talked about and discussed that would be so interesting. But I want to start maybe at the beginning in the concepts that you had in your book, the Why Nations Fail. And I just wonder if you could just take a moment just to talk a little bit. I'm sure you've been asked this question 1,000 times, but why are some nations rich and others poor, divided by wealth and poverty, health and sickness, food and famine? What, from all of your work and study of this, why are some nations rich and others poor?
Well, thank you, Alfreda. Of course, that is a $1 million question, and any answer has to be somewhat simplified. But in Why Nations Fail, we link that to the incentives and opportunities that institutions provide, those that provide broad opportunities and incentives for both workers and businesses to invest, to increase productivity, to be innovative, tend to prosper, and those that do not fall behind. And we call the latter extractive institutions because they function mostly by extracting resources from one group for the benefit of another group. Inclusive institutions are more similar to what we see in our textbooks. Markets that function, that are supported by public services, infrastructure, education, regulation, and tend to be much better for economic efficiency and innovation. That doesn't mean that countries, for example, China today, cannot grow under extractive institutions, but that tends to be less sustainable, less based on innovation, experimentation, and a diverse set of players leading the role. But also, already in Why Nations Fail, the central element is political institutions, not just economics. Inclusive economic institutions that undergird this type of growth are impossible in the long run, unless you also support them by inclusive political institutions that distribute political power broadly. Today, of course, we associate those with democracy, but I wouldn't say just democracy, it's democracy plus. A democracy in which you have polarization, like we do in the United States, or an executive that looks after its own interests without being constrained by both other branches of the government and civil society media, is not going to be inclusive. And so therefore, it is already critical. You can see that we need democratic participation, and we need that democratic participation to work really well for long-run, sustainable, inclusive economic growth.
Are there any particular countries that you could point to that do this well, that seem to be on the far side of failure?
Right. Well, every country is a work in progress. There are lots of problems with uh, with institutions. Institutions are human constructs, and they are always subject to conflict called distributional struggles and so on. But look at Canada. Canadian democracy has not been threatened for more than 100 years. It's a very participatory set of institutions. Economically, inequality has increased in Canada, like it has in many other countries, but to a much more controlled degree. Public services function. People are never held back because they are, not among the richest. And you have regulation of big banks and big public companies continuing. Now, United States, in the grand scheme of things, is also an example of broadly inclusive institutions. But U.S. history has always been much more contested. From the beginning, U.S. started as a very, very unequal country because slavery was part of the constitution and part of the economy of the country from the beginning. As a result of slavery and as a result of other inequities, the power of the federal government was somewhat restricted from the beginning, in particular making it quite difficult for public services and poverty reduction to be exercised in the way that, say, for example, we see that in Canada. But we've also seen the flexibility of U.S. institutions. They have adapted during times of crisis. Uh, Obviously, abolition of slavery, then you see a very different type of adaptation at the end of the Gilded Age with the progressive movement that brought down the huge economic and political power of the robber barons. And then you've also seen a different aspect of the US system to sort of change things quite fundamentally in the process of the civil rights era, protests and reform movements. All of those show two things, both how difficult it is to maintain inclusive institutions and expand them, but also the flexibility of the institutions when you really need them. So my hope and the reason why I'm not despairing in the face of so much inequality and so much adverse trends against democracy is exactly that flexibility, that if we put our mind to it, perhaps there is a way of US institutions to adapt and change to rise to the challenges that we are facing today.
Yeah, unpacking the notion of inequality, and you'd mentioned it earlier, it seems that we, right now, the United States is somewhat of a divided nation in the sense that there is some question of whether or not the American dream is still sustainable, can be obtained. The top 10% of citizens in the United States, the top 10% who are the wealthiest, held 70% of the U.S. net worth. And the top 1% of earners now hold more wealth than all of the middle class. I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Is this a season that we're going through?
Yeah, well, it is a season that we're going through, and we don't know when it's going to end. Absolutely, I think wealth inequality, income inequality, power inequality have reached alarming proportions in this country. And it's true from a number of different perspectives. The American dream was people, regardless of their background, they can rise up. Well, again, it wasn't always perfect. Racial, gender inequities always remained. But there was an element, at least for white males, that American dream was functioning. And the middle class jobs that I mentioned were a very important part of it. People would start with little education, but could get a manufacturing job or a good job in the office or in the transport industry and earn enough to buy a car, a house, build a family. Well, those are the jobs that are disappearing. Those are the jobs that have left the hollow middle in the US wealth and income distribution. But at the same time, also, the automation mechanization process and the huge monopoly of data in the hands of a small group of companies and small group of people have made the very, very top extremely rich as well. And the statistics that you gave are speaking to both of these aspects.
You talked a little bit about the cost of inequality. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. What kind of tax, I suppose, is there on inequality in this nation or any nation?
Well, the cost of inequality for society is multifaceted. I think when inequality increases, we become much less of a community because we are going in very different directions. We're not in a shared economy anymore. Opportunities become much less widely available. Again, I'm going back to the American dream. It means that, somebody who starts from a poor family has the ability to go to the best universities and compete for the best jobs. Well, no longer, because if you are so rich, you get your kids into the best schools already and get the best sort of services, tutoring, capability, opportunities for your children. So it's no longer a fair fight, fair struggle. And high inequality also makes democracy much harder to function. And these are not new. Look, people understood this in the 19th century. The Chartists, when they were agitating for democracy in the 1840s, they were saying we need democracy because inequality is so pernicious that we have to find an institutional way of dealing with inequality. Progressives understood this. And of course, social democrats in Europe understood this. Those were the justifications for William Beveridge's report in 1942 or the Scandinavians' welfare state programs. The question is, what do you do about it? The way that welfare states, which U.S. unwittingly sort of slowly adopted as well with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, is that you deal with this by providing public services such as education, healthcare, and other essential services, and at the same time you use progressive taxation in order to reduce the inequalities. Well, unfortunately, in the US, we've moved in an opposite direction. First of all, the services we provide have become more unequal. The healthcare that the rich get or the education that the rich get is very different because it's locally financed. And progressive taxation, yes, this tax system is still progressive in the United States, especially the federal tax system, but it's much less effective. In the 1950s, 1960s, a third of the US tax came from corporate taxes at the federal level. Today, it's like almost 0% because there's so much tax evasion and we've cut taxes on capital so much that it's all labor income taxes at the federal level. And moreover, as I've shown you, we have created a tax system that actually supports companies to automate rather than create jobs and opportunities for workers. So some of the best tools that we have, we're not using. But also the point that I was trying to make is that taxation is not enough. We're not going to create a dynamic, inclusive society by just having, a number of billionaires and then taxing a little bit of their money so that we create crumbs for the rest of the population. We need to create opportunities for the rest of the population. And for that, I think redirecting technological change is key. That's the part that's really missing, in my opinion, in the public debate, and that's why I'm trying to emphasize it. In the public debate, there are those who, think we should just let the market economy go in whatever direction it's going to go, even if it's the Wild West. And then, those who say we have to, strengthen the unions, increase the minimum wages, and increase redistribution. Sure, we have to do some of those things. Absolutely. We need to have a better safety net. This is the essence of the welfare state 3.0 that I have tried to articulate, but it's not enough. We also need to redirect technological change so that the labor market starts creating opportunities for people.
Yeah, you were talking about, at the Federal Reserve, we talk a lot about the technology-enabled disruption that's happening. And it's interesting that you mentioned that this is this technology it's actually an interruption or disruption to democracy. You mentioned regulation. It's interesting right now, there's talks looking at Facebook, thinking about algorithms and AI that are actually sort of disrupting social structures. How does one go about when it comes to regulating technology? What's the fix for that, do you think? We need technology, obviously, for the 21st century jobs and for our economy. But at the same time, it does seem that we haven't even wrapped our arms around the power that it has, that it can interrupt so many things.
Well, wonderful question. I'm so glad you asked that, because this is the one thing that I didn't have time to get into, and I think it's critical. Well, look, let me start by saying we don't know. I think this is such an important area, and there are so many pitfalls that I would be lying if I said I had answers that are clear. Why Nations Fail, James Robinson and I provide many examples of countries that impoverish themselves because they block technological changes. So when I say regulation of technology, I don't mean blocking of technological changes. Absolutely not. Of course, we have to decide which technologies and how we're going to use them. But exactly like you say, we need technology for improving our living standards, for fighting cancer, for dealing with pandemics, for 21st century jobs. But what types of technologies? How are we going to use them? I think we really need a very detailed framework. We need to start that discussion. But even without having that framework at hand, we know that technology can be redirected, and it can be done so very powerfully. Let me give you one example. And that will also make what I mean by regulation of technology much more concrete. We have, of course, failed the climate change challenge. We are too late in responding, and the dangers are really astronomical. But there is one silver lining in this whole climate change debacle. That's the energy sector's huge redirection of technological change over the last 2 decades. When Al Gore made the Inconvenient Truth movie, it would have been prohibitively costly for US or European economy or the Chinese economy to move away from fossil fuels. That would have meant reducing production hugely, manufacturing and production, heating and other things. Today, you don't have to do that because renewable energy, which was more than an order of magnitude more costly than fossil fuel energy 20 years ago, today is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. You cannot do everything with renewables because of intermittence, and some of the heavy fuels don't have any substitutes yet. But most things that we want to do, electricity generation, fuels, we can do that with the renewables more cheaply and cleanly. How did this happen? Well, it happened because we redirected technological change. And we did just the smallest amount of intervention. US government started providing subsidies to clean energy. Europeans introduced a very, very, very modest carbon tax, much, much lower than what we need to introduce. And consumers and employees started putting pressure on their companies. So this is the social aspect of redirection of technological change. And those minimal changes completely turned around the energy sector, that today it would be absolutely costless to go to renewable energy for about 70% of our energy needs. And in Europe, it's already 20%, and it will increase very rapidly. In the US, we are behind around 11%, but we can increase to 70% quite steadily. So that's an example of regulation of technology. Instead of putting all of our energy onto these fossil fuels and improving coal plants and digging more coal mines, we've actually now have much better geothermal, wind, solar, and increasingly other sources of renewable energy.
Well, it seems to me that that's hopeful. In our last, I can't believe our time is almost gone. In our last minute or so, I wonder, are you hopeful, Daron? You were talking about in your work the Red Queen, sort of the power of state and society. You've talked about investing in people, inclusive institutions, shared prosperity. Are you optimistic? Do you see that there is hope at the end of the day?
Well, there is hope, but I would be foolish to say that I think it's an easy journey. There is, of course, hope. I think today in the US, we are talking about policies that are so much better than what we were talking about 3 or 4 years ago. We are thinking of investing in human and physical infrastructure, in creating a much better social safety net, dealing with economic disparities of all sorts. We are thinking of reining in large corporations that are not paying any taxes, for example, the global corporate minimum tax. None of this would have been feasible or would have been even thinkable 4 years ago. And I think it shows that people are realizing we're at a critical juncture, that it is our civilization at stake. Are we there yet? No, I don't think, for example, the issues of how threatening automation is and the control of data by large companies is on the agenda yet. So some of the proposals, I think, are not exactly dealing with all of the root causes, but I think there's already a recognition. So a little glimmer of hope. Yes, I think I have that. Thank you, Alfreda.
Well, Daron, thank you so much. Great conversation. I could go on much longer, but I so thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alfreda. It's my pleasure.
And thanks everyone for listening. I think that just gives you an idea of what the rest of our week is going to be. It's going to be fantastic. And really, Daron set us up very well to talk about what we're going to do next. In our next session, we're going to this is going to be interesting, the threads of Texas. What does that mean? Well, Catherine Quaylar at the City of Dallas is going to let us know. And remember, at each new virtual session you'll attend this week, you're going to go to the agenda and you're going to click on that session, and that's going to take you into that streaming right away. So let's join this next fascinating conversation. And by the way, be sure you take the Threads of Texas quiz to find out which group you identify most closely with. Okay, virtual room change. See you in the next session.